Imagine you are standing in a cotton field in Mississippi in August of 1850. The heat is not like heat you have ever experienced. It is not the heat of a warm afternoon. It is a weight. It presses down on your shoulders, your chest, your lungs. The air does not move. The sun does not soften. And you have been here since before the sun came up. Your hands are bleeding, not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. The bolls of the cotton plant are sharp, and your hands have been working them open for hours. And the cuts from yesterday have not healed, and the cuts from the day before, that have not healed. And your fingers are torn open in the same places, over and over and over again. You do not stop. You cannot stop. Because the man on the horse at the edge of the field has a whip, and he has used it this morning already. And you know, with a certainty that lives in your body rather than your mind, that he will use it again. You are not a criminal. You have not committed any offense. You are not here because of anything you did or failed to do. You are here because you were born. You were born in this field, or on this plantation, or you were born somewhere else entirely, and then loaded onto a ship or a railroad car or a flatboat, and sold to the man who now owns you the way he owns the horse the overseer is sitting on. You are, under the law of the United States of America, property. Not a second-class citizen. Not a person with limited rights. Property. The same legal category as the cart. The same legal category as the plow. The same legal category as the mule. And here is the thing that most people who learn a few chapters of this history never fully absorb. This was not a marginal arrangement. It was not a regional peculiarity that embarrassed the rest of the nation. It was not a system that the Founding Fathers had reluctantly inherited and quietly planned to dismantle. It was the engine. It was the foundation on which the wealthiest, most powerful republic in the Western world had been constructed. The wealth that built the banks of New York. The wealth that financed the textile mills of New England. The wealth that paid for the roads and the canals and the railroads and the elegant townhouses of Philadelphia and Boston and Charleston and Baltimore. That wealth came from here, from this field, from these bleeding hands, from this body that is not, under the law, a person. American slavery, at its peak, represented the single largest capital investment in the United States of America. Larger than all the railroads combined. Larger than all the factories. Larger than all the banks. In 1860, the year before the Civil War began, the 4 million enslaved people in the American South were valued by their enslavers at approximately $3.5 billion. $3.5 billion in 1860 money. Let me give you the context for that number. The entire federal budget of the United States in 1860 was approximately $63 million. The enslaved people of the American South were worth, to the men who claimed to own them, more than 50 times the annual budget of the federal government. That number is not in most textbooks, and that is not an accident. Now, I want you to hold something in your mind as we begin. Not a statistic, not a date, an image. In the summer of 1619, a ship arrived at Point Comfort, Virginia. It was an English privateer called the White Lion. It carried, among its cargo, approximately 20 to 30 African people who had been taken from a Portuguese slave ship that the White Lion had intercepted at sea. They were sold to the colonists at Point Comfort in exchange for food and supplies. 20 to 30 people. A transaction recorded in a few lines by a colonial secretary named John Rolfe. That transaction was not, by any measure, the beginning of African slavery in the Atlantic world. It was not even the beginning of the forced African presence in the Americas. Both of those stories began more than a century earlier, but it was the beginning of a specific legal and economic architecture. The beginning of a system that would grow and elaborate and calcify over the next 2.5 centuries into something so large, so profitable, so deeply woven into the fabric of American law and American economics and American identity that by the time anyone with real power tried to dismantle it, it took the bloodiest war in American history to do so. And even then, it did not die cleanly. Even then, pieces of it survived. Some pieces are still surviving today. That is what this documentary is about. This is not a story about cruelty for its own sake. I am not going to walk you through the worst details of slavery's violence in order to shock you or to perform a kind of historical horror. The violence was real, it was systematic, and we will look at it honestly, because dishonesty about what was done serves no one. But the violence is not the heart of this story. The heart of this story is a question. How does something this enormous happen? How does a society of people who wrote documents calling liberty an unalienable right, who attended church on Sundays and called themselves Christians, who wrote letters home about honor and decency and the dignity of the human person, how do those people build a system that treated 4 million of their neighbors as livestock? And the answer to that question, the actual documented answer, is not what most people think it is. It is not simply that they were evil. It is not simply that they were hypocrites. The answer is that they built something. Step by step, law by law, court ruling by court ruling, legislative compromise by legislative compromise. They built an institution. They gave it legal standing. They gave it constitutional protection. They gave it economic incentives so powerful that even people who found it morally uncomfortable could not afford to walk away. They made slavery, over 2.5 centuries, into the most powerful institution in the United States of America. And by the time it was strong enough to be that, it was also strong enough to resist almost everything that was thrown at it. That is the story we are going to examine. Not just what slavery was, but how it became what it became. How a crime became a custom. How a custom became a law. How a law became a constitution. How a constitution became a nation. We begin, as we must, at the beginning, not in 1619, earlier than that. Because to understand what happened on the shores of Virginia, you need to understand what the men who built those colonies brought with them in their heads. The ideas, the legal frameworks, the economic logic. You need to understand what they were building toward, and you need to understand what they were willing to destroy to get there. The Virginia colony in the 1610s and 1620s was not a success story. It was, by most measures available to historians, a catastrophe in slow motion. The men who had financed the Virginia Company of London had expected profits. They had expected to find gold, as the Spanish had found gold in South America. They had expected grateful indigenous people willing to trade valuable commodities for European goods. They had expected a relatively straightforward extraction operation. What they found instead was a hostile environment, a population that was not interested in becoming labor for English profit, and a colonial workforce, the white indentured servants brought over to do the work, that kept dying. The death rates in early Virginia were staggering. In the winter of 1609 to 1610, a period the colonists themselves called the starving time, the settlement at Jamestown lost more than 400 of its 500 residents. 400 out of 500 people in a single winter. The colony survived, barely, and continued, but the fundamental problem did not go away. Labor. The tobacco economy that finally, after years of failure, began generating real profit for the Virginia colony in the 1610s required massive amounts of sustained, backbreaking agricultural labor. And that labor was hard to get and hard to keep. White indentured servants came to Virginia under contracts that typically bound them to their employers for 4 to 7 years. After that, they were free. Some of them received land or tools or money at the end of their indenture. They could vote. They could acquire property. They could compete with the men who had employed them. And they were expensive to maintain. The Virginia planters needed something different, something more. And in 1619, the same year those first Africans arrived at Point Comfort, the Virginia colony established its first representative assembly, the House of Burgesses. These two things happened in the same year, the first enslaved Africans and the first representative democracy. That is not a coincidence. It is the central tension of American history, and it was present at the creation. For the first several decades after 1619, the legal status of African people in Virginia was genuinely ambiguous. There were free Africans in the colony. There were Africans who completed periods of indenture and received land. There were Africans who owned property, hired white labor, and participated in the colony's economic life. Anthony Johnson arrived in Virginia sometime around 1620, likely as an indentured laborer. He worked off his indenture. He was freed. He acquired land on the eastern shore of Virginia, approximately 250 acres, and he ran a farm with his wife Mary and their children. He also at some point acquired African indentured servants of his own. When one of those servants, a man named John Casor, tried to claim his freedom, arguing that his indenture had expired, Anthony Johnson went to court, and the court ruled in Johnson's favor. In 1654 or 1655, a Virginia court ruled that John Casor was Anthony Johnson's servant for life. This is one of the first documented cases of what historians call lifetime servitude being enforced by an American court. And here is the detail that complicates the easy narrative. Anthony Johnson was a black man, an African, a man who had himself arrived in Virginia as a bound laborer and worked his way to freedom and land ownership. He was using the courts to claim lifetime ownership of another black man, which tells you something important about what was happening in the 1650s in Virginia. The logic of lifetime servitude did not arrive in Virginia with a racial label already attached. It arrived as economic logic, as the logic of a labor-hungry colony looking for a more permanent, more controllable, more profitable solution to its workforce problem. Race, as a legal category, was something that was built afterward, deliberately, specifically, by men who needed it to work a particular way, because there was a problem with the early Virginia labor system, a problem that would eventually threaten the stability of the entire colony. The problem was that indentured servants finished their contracts, and when they finished their contracts, they needed something: land, work, someplace in the economy. And in the Virginia of the 1660s and 1670s, there was not enough of that for everyone. By 1676, Virginia had several thousand former indentured servants, most of them young men, most of them poor, most of them without land or prospects, most of them armed, because firearms were common in the colony, and they were angry. That anger found a leader in a man named Nathaniel Bacon, and in 1676, Bacon led what became the largest armed rebellion in colonial American history. Bacon's rebellion, as it came to be known, was complicated. Its stated aims were partly about indigenous land, partly about resentment of the colonial governor's wealthy inner circle. But its fuel was the rage of a class of poor white men who felt that the colony had failed them, who had finished their servitude and found nothing waiting on the other side. At its peak, Bacon's forces burned Jamestown to the ground. The rebellion collapsed after Bacon died suddenly of disease in October of 1676. But it terrified the Virginia planter class in a way that nothing had before, not just because of the destruction, because of what it represented. The indentured servant system had created a class of poor, armed, politically conscious white men with nothing to lose, and those men had just demonstrated that they were capable of organized, sustained, violent resistance. The solution the Virginia planters reached for was not to give those men land or opportunity or a fairer share of the colony's wealth. The solution they reached for was to change the composition of the workforce, to replace indentured white servants with enslaved black Africans. Not because Africans were inherently inferior. That argument would come later, constructed specifically to justify a decision that had already been made on purely economic grounds. The practical advantages of African slavery were simple and brutal. Enslaved Africans could not finish a contract. There was no endpoint, no moment at which they would become free, and poor, and angry, and armed. Enslaved Africans were visually distinct from the free population in a way that European indentured servants were not, which made escape and assimilation into the free population much harder to accomplish. Enslaved Africans could not vote, could not hold office, could not go to court, could not own firearms under the laws that were rapidly being written specifically to strip them of every legal protection. And enslaved Africans could be held in perpetuity, and their children could be held, and their children's children, meaning that the initial investment in purchasing a person compounded over generations rather than expiring after 7 years. This was not a moral argument. It was not a theological argument. It was a return on investment calculation. And the Virginia planter class made it clearly, deliberately, and in writing. Between 1660 and 1705, Virginia passed a series of laws that transformed the legal status of African people in the colony step by systematic step. In 1662, Virginia passed a law that changed the fundamental basis of inherited status in the colony. Under English common law, a child's status followed the father. Virginia reversed this. In Virginia, from 1662 onward, a child's status followed the mother. This is one of the most consequential sentences in American legal history. Read it again carefully. A child's status followed the mother. This meant that the children of enslaved women were enslaved, regardless of who their father was, even if their father was the man who enslaved their mother, even if their father was white, even if their father was, legally, a free man. This single law transformed enslaved women into what historians have called reproductive capital. Every child born to an enslaved woman was automatically the property of whoever owned her. The sexual violence that was a pervasive feature of American slavery was thus not merely a crime that happened despite the legal system. It was structurally incentivized by the legal system. An enslaver who raped an enslaved woman was not only committing violence, he was increasing his capital assets. In 1667, Virginia passed a law clarifying that baptism as a Christian did not confer freedom on enslaved people. This mattered because one of the few existing legal and moral frameworks that could have limited the practice of enslaving Africans was the Christian tradition that one Christian could not enslave another Christian. Virginia explicitly closed that door. Your soul might belong to God. Your body belonged to your enslaver. In 1670, Virginia made it illegal for free black people to own white servants. In 1680, Virginia made it illegal for any black person, enslaved or free, to carry weapons or to strike a white person under any circumstances. In 1691, Virginia made interracial marriage illegal. The explicit stated purpose of this law, recorded in the colonial record, was to prevent what the lawmakers called that abominable mixture and spurious issue which hereafter may increase in this dominion. They were drawing a line. They were making race a legal reality, not just a social observation, a legal category with legal consequences, enforced by the power of the state. In 1705, Virginia consolidated all of these individual laws into what became known as the Virginia Slave Code, a comprehensive legal document that, for the first time in the colony's history, collected all of the laws governing the treatment and status of enslaved people into a single framework. The Virginia Slave Code of 1705 established several things clearly. Enslaved people were property. They could be bought, sold, mortgaged, inherited, given as gifts, and seized to pay their owners' debts, exactly as furniture or livestock could be. Enslaved people had no legal standing in courts. They could not sue. They could not testify against white people. They could not enter into contracts. Enslaved people who attempted to resist the authority of their enslavers could be killed without any legal consequence to the killer. The code explicitly stated that it was legal to kill an enslaved person who resisted correction. And the code established something that would become one of the defining features of American racial law for the next 250 years. The presumption of slavery. Under the 1705 Code, any person of African descent in Virginia was presumed to be enslaved unless they could prove otherwise. Read that clearly. The default assumption was bondage. Freedom had to be proved. Slavery was the assumed condition. That legal presumption would follow Black Americans, in various forms, for centuries. Virginia was not alone in building this architecture. Maryland, South Carolina, Georgia, and eventually every colony that had significant agricultural interests developed their own slave codes, most of them closely modeled on Virginia's, many of them even harsher. South Carolina's slave code passed in 1740 after a major enslaved uprising called the Stono Rebellion, was one of the most comprehensive and brutal legal documents in colonial American history. It codified in explicit detail the methods by which enslavers were permitted to discipline, punish, and kill enslaved people who resisted. By the middle of the 18th century, the legal infrastructure of American slavery was not a collection of informal practices and social customs. It was a sophisticated, internally consistent legal system with centuries of colonial court rulings behind it, with detailed statutes governing every aspect of the relationship between enslaved people and those who claimed to own them, with enforcement mechanisms embedded in every level of colonial government from the local constable to the colonial assembly. It had taken roughly a century to build. It had been constructed piece by piece, law by law, court ruling by court ruling, by men who understood exactly what they were building and why. And then, in 1776, those same men, or their children, or the inheritors of their legal and economic world, sat down and wrote that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And they meant it. Or at least some of them meant it in some ways, for some people. And that contradiction, that specific, deliberate, fully documented contradiction, between the words of the Declaration and the reality of the colonies that produced it, is the crack in the foundation of the American Republic that no subsequent generation has ever fully repaired. Let me be precise about what the founders knew, and when they knew it. This is not a story about men who were blind to what they were doing. The historical record is clear on this. Many of the most prominent founders understood that slavery was a moral catastrophe. They said so in letters, in speeches, in private correspondence that has survived in archives and been studied by historians for generations. Thomas Jefferson, who enslaved more than 600 people over the course of his life, who fathered children by an enslaved woman named Sally Hemings, whom he legally owned and never freed, wrote in 1820, at the age of 77, that the question of slavery was like a fire bell in the night, that it filled him with terror. He knew. He had always known. George Washington, who enslaved over 300 people at Mount Vernon, and who pursued an enslaved woman named Ona Judge across multiple states when she fled to freedom, wrote in private correspondence that he hoped slavery would be abolished by slow, sure, and imperceptible degrees. He knew. He had always known. James Madison, who more than any other single person was responsible for the structure of the Constitution, owned over 100 enslaved people at his plantation Montpelier. He wrote that slavery was the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man. He knew. They all knew. The question is not whether they knew. The question is what they chose to do with what they knew. And the answer to that question is in the document they produced in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. The Constitution of the United States of America. Because the Constitution did not merely fail to abolish slavery. It protected it. It gave it constitutional standing. It embedded it into the foundational law of the Republic in ways that would take a war and 3 constitutional amendments to begin to undo. And the specific mechanisms by which it did that are worth examining carefully, because they reveal something important about what the founders actually believed when you strip away the rhetoric about liberty and look at the choices they made when liberty cost something. The first and most famous constitutional protection for slavery is the 3/5 Clause. Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution established that representation in the House of Representatives would be apportioned among the states according to their population. But whose population? The founders had to decide how to count enslaved people. The slaveholding states wanted enslaved people counted fully, because more population meant more representatives and more political power. The free states objected to giving the slave states more representation based on a population that had no political rights whatsoever. People who could not vote, could not hold office, could not participate in the political process in any way. The compromise they reached was that enslaved people would be counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of apportionment. This is regularly taught as a moral horror, as the founders literally declaring that black people were not fully human. And it was a moral horror. but understanding it only as a moral statement misses its actual function. The 3/5 clause was a power grab. It gave the slaveholding states substantially more representation in Congress than they would have had if only free people had been counted. Virginia, the most powerful state in the early republic, had a white population of roughly 450,000 in 1790, and an enslaved population of nearly 300,000. Under the 3/5 rule, those 300,000 enslaved people added the equivalent of 180,000 people to Virginia's census count. People who could not vote. People who had no voice in their own governance. Adding the equivalent of 180,000 phantom voters to the political power of the men who owned them. The slaveholding states used that extra representation to dominate the early republic. 4 of the first 5 presidents of the United States were Virginia slaveholders. The Speaker of the House was a slaveholder for 28 of the first 35 years of the Republic. Slaveholders chaired the most powerful congressional committees for most of the early national period. The 3/5 clause did not make slavery permanent, but it made it politically powerful enough to resist every attempt to limit it. The second major constitutional protection was the slave trade clause. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution prohibited Congress from banning the international slave trade before the year 1808. This was a specific concession to the Deep South states of South Carolina and Georgia, whose rice and indigo economies depended heavily on the continued importation of enslaved Africans, and who had made clear that they would not ratify a constitution that gave Congress immediate power to end that trade. The founders accepted the deal. Congress could not touch the international slave trade for 20 years. In those 20 years, approximately 170,000 additional enslaved Africans were brought to the United States, the largest forced migration in the history of North America. Men and women and children taken from their homes, loaded onto ships under conditions of deliberate cruelty, transported across an ocean, and sold into a legal system designed to hold them and every descendant they would ever produce in permanent bondage. And the Constitution of the United States had guaranteed the men who ran that trade 20 years of federal protection. The third major constitutional protection was the Fugitive Slave Clause. Article 4, Section 2 required that enslaved people who escaped to free states had to be returned to their enslavers. This is one of the most important and least discussed provisions of the original Constitution, because it nationalized slavery. It made slavery not merely a Southern institution protected within the Southern states, but a system that every state in the Union was legally required to enforce. A free state could not simply refuse to return escaped enslaved people. It was constitutionally obligated to participate in the slave system it might find morally abhorrent. This became the source of one of the most significant political crises of the antebellum period. When northern states passed personal liberty laws in the 1840s and 1850s, trying to limit the operation of fugitive slave laws within their borders, the slaveholding South went to Congress and demanded a stronger federal law. The result was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, one of the most aggressive pieces of legislation in American history, which required not just state governments, but private citizens, northern citizens, to assist in the capture and return of people who had escaped slavery. Refusing to help could result in fines and imprisonment. The federal government of the United States was compelling free citizens in free states to participate in the capture of people who had risked their lives to escape bondage. That is not a failure of the system. That is the system functioning as the men who designed it intended. Now I want to step back for a moment and address something that comes up whenever this history is examined carefully. There is a version of this story in which the founders were essentially trapped, in which they had no choice but to accommodate slavery, because the alternative was that the southern states would refuse to join the Union, that there would be no United States of America, and the cause of liberty would be set back by a failure to build the republic at all. This argument has been made seriously by serious historians. It is not without logic, but it has a problem. The problem is that it asks us to accept that building a republic on a foundation of constitutional protections for slavery was better for the cause of human freedom than building a smaller republic without those protections. And the evidence does not obviously support that conclusion. What the Constitution's protections for slavery actually produced was a slaveholding republic powerful enough to expand slavery westward across an entire continent, to protect it politically for 3/4 of a century, and then to fight the bloodiest war in American history to preserve it. The Civil War killed approximately 620,000 soldiers. That number does not include civilians. It does not include the enslaved people who died in the war. It does not include the destruction of property and communities, and the long aftermath of violence and poverty that followed. The question of whether a different set of choices in Philadelphia in 1787 might have produced a better outcome is one that historians have debated for generations. We cannot know the counterfactual with certainty. What we can know from the documentary record is what the choices made in Philadelphia actually produced. And what they produced was the most powerful slave republic in the history of the Western world. By 1860, the American slave system held 4 million people in bondage. It had grown from roughly 700,000 in 1790. It had survived every attempt to limit it. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Every political solution that had been offered had ultimately served to postpone the reckoning rather than resolve it. And in those 70 years between 1790 and 1860, the institution had grown not just in size, but in power, in economic power, in political power, in cultural power. It had produced a class of men, the planter aristocracy of the American South, who were among the wealthiest individuals in the Western world, who had shaped American law and American politics for generations, and who understood with absolute clarity that their wealth, their power, and their way of life depended entirely on the continuation of slavery. And they were willing to do whatever was necessary to protect it. We are going to follow that story. We are going to watch slavery grow. We are going to examine the economic logic that made it so powerful, the legal logic that made it so durable, and the human cost that has been carefully understated in the standard American education. We are going to look at the domestic slave trade, the forced migration of approximately 1 million people from the Upper South to the Deep South between 1790 and 1860. Families separated, children sold, husbands and wives divided and sent in different directions across hundreds of miles. Because the cotton economy of the expanding South needed labor, and the enslaved people of the older tobacco states of Virginia and Maryland and the Carolinas were that labor, bought and sold and transported like cargo. We are going to look at the economics, the specific numbers, how much money was generated by enslaved labor, where that money went, whose wealth was built on it, not just in the South, in the North, in England, in the global financial system that connected the cotton fields of Mississippi to the textile mills of Manchester and the counting houses of New York. We are going to look at the resistance, because resistance is part of this story, and it has been systematically minimized. The scale of the resistance, the sophistication of the resistance, the cost of the resistance to the people who attempted it, and what that resistance tells us about the humanity of the people the system was designed to deny humanity to. And we are going to look at the ideology, the arguments that were made in pulpits and legislatures and university classrooms and popular books and newspapers to justify what was being done. Because those arguments did not disappear when slavery ended. They mutated. They found new forms. And understanding them in their original context is essential to understanding what came after. That is the territory we are moving through together. And we begin in the next section with the thing that made slavery so hard to argue against in the mid-19th century, and so easy to defend. The money. The staggering, almost incomprehensible amounts of money. Because the great moral question of American slavery was not, for most of its history, a question that most powerful Americans were willing to face honestly. And the reason was not primarily that they believed enslaved people were inferior. The reason, the documented reason, The reason that shows up in the letters and the congressional records and the court decisions and the economic analyses of the period was much simpler and much harder to argue with. Slavery made them rich, richer than almost anything else in the world, could have made them at that time. And what we have to reckon with, honestly and completely, is how that wealth shaped a nation, how it built institutions, how it funded education and churches and political careers and civic life, how it created a culture in which the idea of ending slavery was not merely a political disagreement, but an existential threat to an entire civilization's economic foundation. To understand why slavery lasted as long as it did, you have to understand how deeply it had grown into everything. That is where we go next. There is a question that economists ask when they study American slavery, a question that historians have spent 2 centuries circling without always being willing to land on the answer directly. If slavery was morally wrong, and most educated people in 1800 knew it was morally wrong, why did it keep growing? Why, in the 50 years between 1790 and 1840, did the enslaved population of the United States not shrink toward extinction as the institution became harder to defend publicly? Why did it nearly quadruple, from approximately 700,000 people to more than 2.4 million? Why, in the face of abolition movements in Britain and France, and the gradual emancipation laws passing in the northern states, did American slaveholders not begin the slow, quiet wind-down of a system that every serious moral thinker of the era had already condemned? The answer is not complicated. The answer is cotton. And once you understand what cotton did to the economics of slavery in America, once you understand the numbers, the real numbers, the numbers that have been buried under 2 centuries of selective memory, you will understand something that changes the entire frame of this story. American slavery did not survive into the 19th century, despite being economically inefficient. It survived because it was, by the measures that drive human behavior, one of the most profitable economic systems ever devised. And it was not just profitable for slaveholders in Mississippi and Georgia and Alabama. It was profitable for banks in New York, for insurance companies in Boston, for textile mills in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, for shipping merchants in Baltimore and Philadelphia, for cotton brokers in Liverpool and Manchester. The wealth that slavery produced did not stay in the South. It traveled up through every artery of the American and Atlantic economies and built institutions that still exist today. That is the story of part 2. Not just the suffering, the money, where it came from, where it went, who collected it, and why that financial architecture made slavery so much harder to dismantle than any purely moral argument could account for. In 1793, a young Connecticut schoolteacher named Eli Whitney was staying at a Georgia plantation owned by the widow of a Revolutionary War general. He watched enslaved workers spend hours laboriously separating the sticky seeds from short staple cotton fiber by hand, a task so slow and tedious that short staple cotton, the variety that grew readily across the entire inland South, was barely worth cultivating. Whitney built a machine in 10 days, a simple device of wire teeth and a rotating drum, the cotton gin. A single cotton gin could do the work of 50 people separating cotton by hand. Eli Whitney thought he was going to become fabulously wealthy from his invention. He patented it, tried to license it, and spent years in unsuccessful litigation as planters copied his design without paying him, and courts in the South declined to enforce his claims. He died in 1825 without ever making the money he expected from it. But what his invention produced was something beyond any individual fortune. It produced a revolution. Before the cotton gin, the upper limit on American cotton production was set by the speed of human hands doing the work of separating the fiber. After the cotton gin, that limit was set by something else entirely, by how much land could be cleared, and how many enslaved people could be forced to work it. In 1790, before the gin, the United States produced approximately 1.5 million pounds of cotton. In 1800, 7 years after Whitney's invention, that number had grown to approximately 35 million pounds. In 1820, it was 167 million pounds. In 1840, it was 834 million pounds. In 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, the United States was producing approximately 2.3 billion pounds of cotton per year. Let me put that in perspective. In 1860, the United States produced roughly 2/3 of all the cotton consumed by the entire world. 2/3 of the entire global supply. From one country, from one crop, produced almost entirely by enslaved labor. Cotton was, by 1860, the single most valuable export of the United States of America. It was worth more than all other American exports combined. It accounted for approximately 60% of total American export earnings. The economy of the most powerful republic in the Western world ran on cotton, and cotton ran on slavery. This is not a metaphor. This is arithmetic, and the arithmetic had a very specific set of consequences. Because the cotton boom did not merely make individual slaveholders wealthy, it created demand. Enormous, insatiable demand. Demand for land to grow cotton on. Demand for labor to work that land. And demand, above all, for enslaved people. That demand transformed the institution of slavery from a labor system into a financial system. One of the most sophisticated financial systems in the world. Here's something that is almost never taught in the standard American history classroom, and I want you to understand why that is before I tell you what it was. The international slave trade to the United States was banned in 1808. That is taught. That is in the textbooks. It sounds like progress. It sounds like the beginning of the end. What is not taught with anything approaching the same emphasis is what happened next. When the international trade closed, the domestic trade exploded. The cotton economy of the Deep South needed labor. Vast quantities of labor. More than any amount of natural population growth could supply in the short term. And the older tobacco and rice economies of Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas had large enslaved populations that the changing economics of those crops could no longer profitably sustain. The solution was commerce. Between 1790 and 1860, approximately 1 million enslaved people were forcibly relocated from the Upper South to the Deep South through the domestic slave trade. 1 million people. Sold, transported, resold. Mothers separated from children, husbands separated from wives, brothers and sisters divided and sent in opposite directions across hundreds of miles of territory with no ability to communicate, no possibility of reunion, no legal recourse of any kind. 1 million people. This migration was not incidental to the slave economy. It was one of its central industries. Slave trading was a significant and lucrative profession practiced by men who built large businesses around the buying, transport, and sale of human beings. These were not shadowy operations conducted in secret. They were firms. They had offices. They ran advertisements in newspapers. They had holding facilities, called slave pens or slave jails, in cities across the South, where people were held while awaiting sale. The largest of these operations were clustered in Richmond, Virginia, the most important slave trading city in America. In New Orleans, the second largest. In Natchez, Mississippi. In Charleston, South Carolina. The firm of Franklin and Armfield, based in Alexandria, Virginia, was one of the largest slave trading businesses in American history. Isaac Franklin and John Armfield ran what was, by the standards of the time, a sophisticated commercial operation. They purchased enslaved people in Virginia and Maryland, held them in a large compound in Alexandria, transported them overland by chain gang or by coastal ship to Natchez and New Orleans, and sold them to planters in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. In peak years, Franklin and Armfield moved between 1,000 and 1,500 enslaved people per year through their operation. They became very wealthy men. Isaac Franklin retired to a plantation in Tennessee, built a mansion, was married in a respectable ceremony, and died a celebrated member of his community. The men who ran the domestic slave trade were not considered criminals. They were not social outcasts. Some were, and the genteel planter class liked to keep a certain performative distance from the actual business of buying and selling people. But the trade itself was legal, regulated, taxed, and embedded in the commercial fabric of American cities in ways that touched virtually every sector of the economy. Here's what I mean by that. When a planter in Mississippi wanted to purchase an enslaved person from a trader in Richmond, he often did not pay cash. He took out a loan, a mortgage, a financial instrument backed by the value of the person he was purchasing. Those mortgages were bought and sold by banks. They were packaged into financial instruments that were traded on markets in New York and London and Amsterdam. They were backed by insurance policies written by companies in New York and New England. The enslaved people of the American South were not just labor. They were collateral. They were financial assets whose value could be borrowed against, securitized, and traded across the entire Atlantic financial system. This is not a metaphor or an abstraction. This is what the financial records show. And historians, most prominently Edward Baptist in his book The Half Has Never Been Told, and Sven Beckert in Empire of Cotton, have spent the last 2 decades pulling those records out of archives and documenting exactly how it worked. The mortgages on enslaved people that were originated in the American South were packaged and sold to investors in New York and London, much as mortgage-backed securities would be packaged and sold 2 centuries later. European capital financed the expansion of the American slave economy. American slave-produced cotton financed the growth of the transatlantic financial system. These were not separate worlds. They were one world. And that has consequences for how we understand who was responsible for slavery. Not just the men who held the whips, not just the planters who owned the land, but the entire financial architecture of the Atlantic world that invested in the system, profited from it, and had strong economic incentives to see it continue. Let me give you the geography of the money, because it matters. In 1860, New York City was the financial capital of the United States. Its banking houses, insurance companies, and commercial firms were deeply embedded in the cotton economy. The trade worked like this. Southern planters grew cotton. They sold it to cotton factors, brokers who operated in the major port cities of the South, primarily New Orleans and Charleston and Savannah. Those factors arranged the shipping, took their commission, and transferred the cotton to trading firms in New York or directly to buyers in Liverpool and Manchester. The New York firms financed the whole cycle. They extended credit to the Southern planters to buy land and enslaved people. They arranged the insurance on the cotton during transport. They handled the banking transactions between American and British markets. Firms like Brown Brothers, which would eventually become Brown Brothers Harriman, one of the oldest and most prestigious private banks in America, were deeply involved in the cotton trade and in the financing of the slave economy. James and William Brown, the founders, built their American fortune substantially on the credit they extended to the Cotton South. This is documented. It is not controversial among historians. It is simply not taught. The insurance companies of New England insured the enslaved people themselves, not just the cotton. Life insurance policies on enslaved people were a significant product line for American and British insurance companies. If an enslaved person died, the policy paid the owner for the lost value. Enslaved people were insured as productive assets. The textile mills of New England, which employed tens of thousands of free workers, and which New England mill owners and politicians liked to present as the morally superior alternative to Southern slavery, ran on Southern cotton. The mill towns of Lowell and Lawrence and Fall River in Massachusetts, of Pawtucket and Providence in Rhode Island, of Manchester and New Hampshire were built on the labor of enslaved people in Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama. Not directly. The workers in the mills were free, but the raw material that employed them, that generated the profits that built the mill owners' mansions and funded their charitable foundations and endowed the universities they sent their children to, was produced by enslaved labor. The Harvard historian Sven Beckert estimates that by 1860, approximately half of the American workforce was connected to cotton in some way. Not all of them in the South. Many in the North. Many in England. The economic historian Edward Baptist has estimated that approximately half of the economic activity of the United States in 1836 was in some way connected to slavery, not just cotton. The goods and services required to sustain the slave economy. The food that fed enslaved people, the clothing they wore, the tools they used, the ships that transported the cotton, the insurance companies, the banks, the counting houses, half the economy of the United States. This is why slavery lasted as long as it did. Not because the people who ran it were unusually evil, because the people who profited from it, directly and indirectly, were spread across an entire civilization. Because the financial tentacles of the slave economy reached into places that had no enslaved people on their streets and no plantations within 100 miles. It was the same reason that ending it required a war rather than a political compromise. By 1860, there was no painless way to end it. There was no financial mechanism that would have made the people who held $3.5 billion in human capital whole, while simultaneously freeing the people who constituted that capital. The numbers did not allow for a quiet solution, and the men who owned that capital knew it. They had done the arithmetic. I want to talk about something that historians have documented carefully, and that almost no popular account of American slavery treats with the full weight it deserves. The slave system was not static. It was not merely the continuation of a colonial practice that people were too set in their ways to change. It was an industrial system. It was optimized. It was engineered. The cotton economy produced in the American South between roughly 1800 and 1860 was not running at the productivity levels of colonial slavery. It was running at dramatically higher levels. And the mechanism that drove those higher levels was one of the most disturbing things that the historical record of this period reveals. American slavery developed, over the course of the 19th century, a systematic approach to extracting maximum labor from enslaved people that historians now recognize as a form of industrial management applied to human beings. The most basic tool was the quota system. Enslaved people in cotton-picking operations were assigned daily picking quotas. These quotas were not fixed. They were set based on the maximum output the fastest picker in the work gang had achieved. If anyone exceeded the quota one day, the quota for the next day was raised. For everyone. The punishment for falling short of the quota was immediate and physical. The whip. This created a system of permanent competitive pressure in which enslaved workers were compelled to pick as fast as they could every single day, knowing that their best day would become the floor for the next day, and that falling below that floor would result in violence. Edward Baptist, after years of studying the account books and testimony records from the cotton economy, documented that the amount of cotton an enslaved picker was expected to pick in a day increased by approximately 400% between 1800 and 1860. 400% over 6 decades. That increase cannot be explained by improved seeds or better tools or any other technological factor. It was driven by the systematic application of torture as a labor management strategy. The account books survive. The records kept by cotton planters, which historians have studied in detail, show quota records, punishment records, productivity figures. They show the system working exactly as it was designed to work. And the people running it understood what they were doing. They called it the pushing system. They discussed it in agricultural journals. They compared notes at county fairs about which management techniques were most effective at driving productivity higher. They were running labor camps, and they were optimizing them. This detail matters for a specific reason. It is common in American cultural memory to treat slavery as a kind of brutal but economically backward institution, a relic of pre-modern agriculture that was swept away by the superior productivity of free labor. The evidence does not support this picture. The plantation agriculture of the American South in the 1850s was, in terms of raw productivity per acre and per worker, among the most efficient large-scale agricultural operations in the world. It was productive not despite being a system of forced labor, but because of the specific mechanisms used to enforce that labor. The economist Robert Fogel, who spent decades analyzing the quantitative records of the slave economy, calculated that Southern slave plantations were, on average, approximately 35% more productive than Northern free farms of equivalent size. 35% more productive in 1860. Free labor was not more efficient than slave labor in the economic conditions of the antebellum South. This is not a defense of slavery. It is a fact about why it was so economically entrenched, and why the argument that the market would eventually make it unprofitable and lead to its natural death was, at best, wishful thinking. Slavery was profitable. It was growing more profitable. It was expanding. It was spreading west into new territories. And the men who ran it had no economic incentive in 1860 or 1850 or 1840 to stop. I have given you numbers and economic systems. Now, I want to make sure we do not let those abstractions stand between us and what was actually happening to actual people. Because the numbers are real, and the people behind the numbers were real. And the gap between the two things is exactly the gap that the slave system needed to maintain in order to function. The system needed the people running it to think of the people being run through it as units of production, as entries in a ledger, as assets rather than persons. And the most insidious thing about studying slavery through economic history is that you can fall into the same perceptual trap. You can read the numbers long enough that you forget what the numbers represent. So let me be direct about what the domestic slave trade actually looked like at the human level. A woman named Harriet Newby received a letter from her husband, Dangerfield Newby, in 1859. Dangerfield was a free black man in Ohio. Harriet was still enslaved in Virginia, with their children. He had been trying to purchase her freedom. The letter her enslaver wrote back said that the price had gone up. It would now cost $1,500 to buy Harriet and their youngest child. Dangerfield Newby did not have $1,500. He had tried to raise it. He could not. He joined John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in October of 1859. He was one of the first men killed in the fighting. He was trying to free his wife. A man named Solomon Northup was a free black man living in New York with his wife and 3 children. He was a skilled violinist and carpenter. In 1841, he was offered work as a musician for a traveling circus and went to Washington, D.C. with 2 white men he believed were legitimate employers. He was drugged, kidnapped, chained, and sold to a slave trader. He spent the next 12 years enslaved on a cotton plantation in Louisiana before he was finally able to get word to his family in New York and be rescued. He wrote a memoir. It was called 12 Years a Slave. It was published in 1853 and became one of the most widely read accounts of slavery in American history. In it, he describes the auction in which he was sold in New Orleans. He describes watching a mother named Eliza and her 2 children, Emily and Randall, sold separately. The mother begging the buyers to keep them together. The buyers ignoring her. The children taken in different directions while their mother screamed. He writes that in all his 12 years in slavery, no sight he witnessed ever burned itself into his memory more deeply than the face of that woman watching her children be taken from her. There were millions of those moments. Millions of auctions. Millions of separations. The historical record documents that in the domestic slave trade between 1820 and 1860, approximately 1 in 3 enslaved marriages was broken by sale. Approximately 1 in 3 enslaved children under the age of 14 was separated from at least one parent through sale. These are not estimates. They are calculations based on slave sale records, estate inventories, and the testimony of survivors. 1 in 3, in every generation, for decades. The grief of those separations was real, and it was known to be real, and it was accepted as a cost of doing business. That is the human price of the cotton economy. That is what the ledger entries represent when you translate them back into lives. And I want to be clear about something. The people who endured this did not endure it passively. The resistance was constant, varied, sophisticated, and dangerous. American slavery is sometimes taught, implicitly, as a story about victims, about suffering without agency. This is false. The resistance to slavery was real. It was continuous, and it took forms that ranged from the quiet and individual to the collective and catastrophic for the slave system. At the individual level, resistance was woven into the daily fabric of enslaved life, working slowly, breaking tools, feigning illness, stealing food, maintaining cultural practices and religious life that enslavers tried to suppress, running away, Running away was the most common form of serious individual resistance, and enslaved people did it by the tens of thousands. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was passed specifically because northern free states were not returning escaped enslaved people with the reliability that slaveholders demanded. The scale of running away was large enough to require a major federal law. Harriet Tubman escaped slavery in Maryland in 1849. She was 27 years old. She traveled on foot and by night through nearly 100 miles of hostile territory, guided partly by the stars, and reached Philadelphia. That alone was an act of extraordinary courage. She then went back, 19 times. Over the course of a decade, Harriet Tubman returned to the South and guided approximately 70 people out of slavery. She operated under constant threat of capture and death. There was eventually a bounty on her head of $40,000, an enormous sum equivalent to well over $1 million today. She was never caught. She never lost a passenger. She said later that she never ran the railroad off the tracks because she never allowed a person who had started the journey to turn back. She understood that anyone who turned back under the pressure of fear could, under worse pressure, be induced to give information about the routes and the safe houses and the network of free black and white abolitionists that made escape possible. She ran it that way. Without exceptions, she is one of the most effective resistance operators in the history of American slavery. And she was doing this in the 1850s, when the Fugitive Slave Act made harboring an escaped enslaved person a federal crime. When the legal weight of the federal government of the United States was being used to hunt her passengers down in free states. But individual resistance, however heroic, was not the only form. There were large-scale uprisings, more of them than is typically taught. Gabriel Prosser organized a conspiracy in Virginia in 1800 that was intended to involve thousands of enslaved people in an armed march on Richmond. The conspiracy was betrayed by 2 enslaved men who informed on it. Gabriel and dozens of others were executed. Virginia tightened its slave codes significantly in the aftermath. Denmark Vesey, a free black man in Charleston, South Carolina, organized what historians believe was one of the most sophisticated conspiracy networks in the history of American slavery. In 1822, his network had recruited thousands of enslaved and free black people across a wide geographic area and planned a large-scale uprising to seize the city. The conspiracy was also betrayed before it could be executed. Vesey and 34 others were executed. More than 30 were transported. In 1831, a man named Nat Turner led the only large-scale, sustained armed slave rebellion in American history. Turner was an enslaved man in Southampton County, Virginia, who believed he had received divine visions calling him to lead his people to freedom. In August of 1831, Turner and a small group of followers began moving through the county, killing white slaveholding families and gathering more followers as they went. At their peak, they numbered approximately 70 men. They were suppressed within 2 days by militia forces and state troops. Turner was captured, tried, and hanged in November. But the aftermath of Nat Turner's rebellion revealed something important about what American slavery actually was beneath its legal surface. In the weeks following the rebellion, white militias and vigilante groups in Virginia and neighboring states killed somewhere between 100 and 200 black people. Most of them had no connection to Turner's rebellion. Many were free black people. They were killed in a wave of retaliatory terror. Virginia held a genuine legislative debate in the months after the rebellion about whether to begin gradual emancipation. The debate was real. The arguments were serious. Legislators spoke openly about the dangers that slavery posed to the social stability of the state. The debate ended with a decision to do the opposite of emancipation. Virginia passed the strictest slave codes in its history. Freedom of assembly for black people was severely restricted. Black people were prohibited from holding religious meetings without a white person present. Education of enslaved people was criminalized. The system, when threatened, did not reform. It tightened. This is the pattern you see again and again across the history of American slavery. Every significant act of resistance, individual or collective, produced not liberalization, but entrenchment. Not reform, but escalation. because the men who ran the system understood, at a level that was clearer than almost anything else in their political and economic lives, that any softening of the enforcement architecture created risk, that any acknowledgement of the humanity of enslaved people created a logical obligation that the system could not survive. So they did not soften. They hardened. And with every tightening of the codes, with every new restriction on black assembly and black education and black movement, they made the system slightly more brutal and slightly more stable, until the point where only a war could break it. I want to spend some time on this, because it matters enormously for what came after. American slavery did not go undefended. It was not simply practiced in embarrassed silence while everyone privately knew it was wrong. It was argued for, systematically, publicly, by intelligent and educated people in the most prominent forums available to them. The pro-slavery argument went through several phases. In the colonial period and the early republic, the argument was primarily one of necessity. Slavery was unfortunate, some said, but necessary. The economy of the South required it. The social order required it. It was a necessary evil. Thomas Jefferson used exactly this language. A necessary evil, a problem for future generations to solve. But as the 19th century progressed and abolitionism grew louder and more insistent, and as the cotton economy made slavery more profitable rather than less, the argument shifted. The necessary evil argument required its proponents to acknowledge that slavery was, in fact, an evil. And that acknowledgement created political and moral exposure. The new argument developed and refined in the 1820s and 1830s, and reaching its full elaboration in the 1840s and 1850s, abandoned the apology entirely. Slavery, the new argument went, was not a necessary evil. It was a positive good. This was the argument of John C. Calhoun, senator from South Carolina and the most intellectually formidable defender of slavery in American history. In a speech on the floor of the Senate in 1837, Calhoun said explicitly that slavery was a good, not an evil, a positive good, and that the existing relations between the races in the South formed the most safe and stable basis for free institutions in the world. He was not speaking from personal embarrassment or political expediency. He believed it. Or he had constructed a framework elaborate enough to function like belief. Calhoun's argument rested on several pillars. First, that some form of subordinated labor was necessary in every civilized society, and that the Roman slaves, the serfs of Europe, and the free workers of northern factories were all subject to forms of exploitation that differed from American chattel slavery in degree rather than in kind. The northern textile worker, Calhoun argued, was not free in any meaningful sense. He was subject to the market, to unemployment, to poverty, to the power of his employer. The enslaved person in the South, by contrast, had security, food, shelter, medical care, the paternal protection of his owner. This was not an argument made in bad faith by cynical politicians. It was made in various forms by economists, by theologians, by university professors, by physicians who published papers claiming to document the biological inferiority of black people and their natural fitness for the condition of slavery. Samuel Cartwright, a Louisiana physician, published papers in the 1850s purporting to describe medical conditions specific to black people, conditions that he claimed made them psychologically incapable of handling freedom. One of these conditions he called drapetomania, the irrational desire to run away from slavery. He was serious. He was published in respected medical journals. This is the kind of ideological work that a profitable institution generates in its defense. It does not only argue politically, it recruits science, it recruits theology, it recruits every authoritative voice available. In the decades before the Civil War, there were Southern ministers publishing biblical defenses of slavery that ran to hundreds of pages. They identified Noah's curse on Ham as a divine sanction for the enslavement of African people. They argued that Paul's epistle to Philemon endorsed the return of a runaway slave. They produced systematic theological arguments that the Christian duty of care for enslaved people was the highest expression of Christian civilization. These arguments did not convince the abolitionists. But they were not aimed at the abolitionists. They were aimed at the majority of white Southerners and the large portion of white Northerners who were not committed abolitionists, who had no particular affection for slavery, but who needed some framework within which it could be accepted as part of the normal order of things. And they worked, or they worked well enough for long enough. The ideological defense of slavery served a specific and crucial function in the political economy of antebellum America. It made the people who ran the system feel that they were not monsters. It gave them a language in which to defend themselves and to the world. It created a cultural framework in which slavery was not a crime being committed, but a civilization being maintained. This matters for understanding what came after emancipation, because the ideology did not die with slavery. It mutated. The arguments about black incapacity for freedom, about the paternalistic necessity of white control over black lives, about the natural social order of racial hierarchy. These arguments did not disappear in April of 1865 when Lee surrendered at Appomattox. They reappeared, in only slightly altered forms, in the black codes that Southern states passed within months of the war's end, in the sharecropping and convict leasing systems that replaced chattel slavery, in the Jim Crow laws, in the pseudoscientific racism of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in the arguments made against civil rights legislation in the 1950s and 1960s. The ideological architecture of slavery proved, in the long run, almost as durable as the economic architecture, because it had been built just as carefully, just as deliberately, by just as many intelligent people who had just as much invested in its survival. There is a final set of numbers I want to give you before we move into the next section of this story. Not production numbers or financial figures, different numbers. The number of people. We know, because the census records survive, that there were approximately 3.9 million enslaved people in the United States in 1860. That is almost certainly an undercount. Census methodology in the antebellum South was imperfect, and there were economic and political incentives to misreport. But let us use that number. 3.9 million people. Each of them had a name. Each of them had a life before the auction block, a life on the plantation, hopes and memories and people they loved. Each of them had a body that could be bought and sold and worked to the edge of its capacity and punished for falling short of that capacity. We do not know most of their names. The records that survive, the plantation account books, the estate inventories, the bills of sale, the census records, recorded them with the same vocabulary used for livestock. A female, aged approximately 25, valued at $800. 3 males, field hands, valued at $1,200 each. A carpenter, aged approximately 35, valued at $1,600. Valuable assets whose names were, for purposes of the record, irrelevant. The historians and genealogists and descendants who have spent decades trying to reconstruct the family trees of enslaved people work against this documentary silence. They work from fragments. From the testimony collected by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s, when interviewers talked to the last surviving people who had been born into slavery, from the Freedmen's Bureau records, from church records, from letters, from the oral histories preserved in families. There are names, many names, but the majority of the 3.9 million people recorded in the 1860 census as property are, in the historical record, nameless. This is not an accident. The system that made them property also made their individuality, their names, their family histories, their identities as persons legally invisible. That invisibility was not a side effect of slavery. It was one of its essential mechanisms. A person with a name, a family, a history, a community is a person. A person is harder to treat as an entry in a ledger. The legal erasure of black personhood was the philosophical foundation on which every other aspect of the system rested. And it is why the work of recovery, the work of finding the names and telling the stories, is not simply of historical interest. It is the work of restoring the personhood that the system was designed to destroy. We have covered the foundation, how the legal architecture was built, and we have covered the economics, how the system grew into the most powerful financial institution in American history. In the next section, we go to the breaking point, to the decade of the 1850s, the most politically explosive decade in American history. The decade in which the contradictions that the founders had papered over and the compromises that their successors had patched and repatched finally tore beyond any available repair. The decade in which the country that had been built on a lie ran out of capacity to sustain the lie. The decade that led to Fort Sumter, and the 4 years of slaughter that followed. There is a moment in American history when the machinery stopped working. Not because it was wrong. The people running it had always known it was wrong, and that had never slowed it down. It stopped working because it ran out of room. By 1850, the slave system had grown so large and so hungry that it had consumed every political compromise designed to contain it, and it needed more. More land, more territory, more room to expand west. And the men who ran it were willing to take the entire republic apart to get it. That is the story of the 1850s, the decade in which every remaining seam of the American political fabric tore open, one by one, until there was nothing left to tear, and 4 years of slaughter became the only available arithmetic. I want to walk you through that decade carefully, not as a list of events, but as a sequence of choices, because what the 1850s reveal, more clearly than any other period in American history, is what the slave system actually was at the level of political will. It was not a relic that powerful people were too timid to dismantle. It was a project, an ongoing, aggressive, expansionist project, driven by men who understood exactly what they were doing and who were willing to destroy every institution in their path to protect it. And understanding that changes how you understand everything that followed. We need to start in 1820, briefly, to understand the pressure that had been building for 30 years before the 1850s arrived. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was the first major congressional attempt to manage the westward expansion of slavery. Missouri applied for statehood as a slave state. The northern states objected. After months of debate and near collapse of the congressional coalition that held the young republic together, a deal was reached. Missouri would enter as a slave state. Maine would simultaneously enter as a free state, preserving the balance in the Senate. And slavery would be prohibited in all future territories north of latitude. 36 degrees, 30 minutes, the southern border of Missouri. Thomas Jefferson, then 77 years old, read the news of the compromise at his home in Monticello. He wrote in a letter that it filled him with terror, that it was a fire bell in the night, awakening and filling him with dread. He understood what it meant, that the question of slavery's expansion was now the central question of American politics, and that no compromise on it would hold forever, that eventually the country would have to choose. He died 6 years later, still enslaving more than 100 people, having freed only 5 in his lifetime. The Missouri Compromise held for 30 years. Then it was destroyed. In 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The stated purpose was to organize the territories of Kansas and Nebraska for settlement and eventual statehood. The mechanism was a doctrine Douglas called popular sovereignty. The settlers of each territory would vote on whether to allow slavery. Whatever the majority decided would stand. The practical effect was to repeal the Missouri Compromise, because Kansas and Nebraska both lay north of 36 degrees 30 minutes, the line below which the compromise had permitted slavery. Popular sovereignty meant that slavery could now potentially expand anywhere, regardless of where the 1820 line had been drawn. Douglas believed popular sovereignty was a pragmatic solution. Let the people of each territory decide. Take the question out of Washington. Diffuse the crisis. What it actually produced was the opposite of diffusion. It produced a war, not the Civil War, not yet. A smaller, earlier war that history calls Bleeding Kansas. Pro-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas from Missouri. Anti-slavery settlers flooded in from the north. Both sides came armed. Both sides established rival governments. a pro-slavery mob sacked the anti-slavery town of Lawrence in May of 1856, destroying buildings and newspaper presses. 3 days later, a man named John Brown led a retaliatory raid in which 5 pro-slavery settlers were killed on Pottawatomie Creek. John Brown. Remember that name. We are going to come back to it. Bleeding Kansas ran for nearly 3 years. Approximately 55 people were killed in the fighting, a small number by the standards of what was coming, but enormous in its political significance. Kansas was not a minor territorial dispute. It was a demonstration of what expansion of slavery actually meant in practice. It meant guns. It meant bodies. It meant 2 visions of America fighting in a field in the middle of the continent over who was going to control the future. And Washington watched and argued and did what it had always done when the slave question became too dangerous to resolve. It tried to find another deal. There was no deal available. There never had been. The deals had only postponed the reckoning. In March of 1857, the Supreme Court of the United States made what is almost certainly the worst judicial decision in American history. The case was Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott was an enslaved man who had been taken by his enslaver to the free state of Illinois and the free territory of Wisconsin before being returned to Missouri, a slave state. On the basis of his extended residence in free territory, Scott sued for his freedom. The case worked its way through the courts for years before reaching the Supreme Court. Chief Justice Roger Taney of Maryland, a slave state, wrote the majority opinion. Taney ruled, first, that Dred Scott had no right to sue in federal court. Because he was black, he was not a citizen of the United States, not a second-class citizen, not a citizen with restricted rights, not a citizen at all. The opinion stated explicitly that black people, whether enslaved or free, were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. No rights which the white man was bound to respect. These words were written by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States in an official legal opinion that was binding on the entire country. But Taney was not finished. He went on to rule that Congress had never had the constitutional authority to ban slavery from any territory, that the Missouri Compromise had been unconstitutional from the moment it was passed, that enslaved people were property, and that the Constitution protected property rights everywhere in the United States, and that no act of Congress or any territorial government could legally interfere with a slaveholder's right to take his property, meaning enslaved people, anywhere in the country. This ruling did not simply affect Dred Scott. It nationalized slavery. It said, in the clearest possible legal language, that there was no place in the United States of America where slavery could be legally prohibited. Not the North, not the territories, not the new states being carved out of the West. Everywhere was slave country, by order of the Supreme Court. The reaction in the North was not primarily horror, though there was horror. The reaction was political earthquake. Because the Dred Scott decision made the position of the new Republican Party, which had been organized specifically to oppose the expansion of slavery, not just unpopular in the South, but potentially unconstitutional. If Congress could not ban slavery from the territories, the platform the Republican Party had been built on was legally void. The decision radicalized enormous numbers of people in the North who had not previously been abolitionists. People who had no particular feeling about slavery in the states where it already existed suddenly had to reckon with the possibility that it was coming to their states because the highest court in the country had just said there was no legal mechanism to stop it. It made Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln had been a moderate Whig congressman from Illinois with a respectable but unspectacular political career. He had returned to serious political engagement, specifically in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He debated Stephen Douglas in a series of Senate race debates in 1858 that brought him to national attention. His position on slavery was not abolitionist, and it is important to be honest about this. In 1858, and even in 1860, Lincoln did not run on a platform of ending slavery where it existed. He ran on the platform of stopping its expansion. He was explicit, in multiple speeches, that he did not believe in racial equality in the sense that abolitionists meant it. He did not believe in black suffrage or intermarriage. What he believed, with genuine conviction, was that slavery should not be allowed to expand into new territories, that the founders had intended it to be put on a course toward eventual extinction, and that the slave power's increasingly aggressive demands were destroying the Republic. That was enough. That was more than enough for the men who ran the slave system. When Lincoln won the presidential election of 1860, the response from the Deep South was immediate and unambiguous. South Carolina seceded from the Union on December 20th, 1860. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed within the next 6 weeks. They did not wait to see what Lincoln would actually do. They did not wait for him to be inaugurated. They did not give the new government a chance to act. They seceded because he had been elected. The election itself was the unacceptable event, and the documents they produced to explain their secession make the reason plain in language that could not be clearer. Mississippi's Declaration of Secession begins with this sentence: "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world." Georgia's declaration states that the prohibition of slavery in the territories is the cardinal point of Republican Party doctrine, and that the party elected Lincoln for the express purpose of ending the prosperity of the slaveholders. South Carolina's declaration runs to thousands of words. It devotes the majority of its length to the argument that the northern states had violated the constitutional compact by failing to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act with sufficient vigor, by allowing anti-slavery sentiment to exist in their populations, by electing a man who opposed slavery's expansion. These documents are in the historical record. They are publicly available. They say, in plain language, what the war was about. It was about slavery. It was about protecting slavery. It was about the economic and political interests of men who had built a civilization on the ownership of human beings, and who were willing to destroy the United States of America, rather than allow any restriction on their ability to do so. This is not a contested point among historians. It has not been a contested point for decades. The lost cause mythology that reinvented the war as being about states' rights, about tariffs, about abstract constitutional principles, that mythology was constructed after the war by the men who had lost it and needed a story to live inside. It does not survive contact with the actual documents. The actual documents say slavery, plainly, repeatedly. In the first paragraph, Fort Sumter fell on April 13th, 1861. Confederate forces had been bombarding the Federal garrison in Charleston Harbor for 33 hours before the Union commander, Major Robert Anderson, surrendered. No one was killed in the bombardment. The war's first casualty was a Union soldier killed in an accidental explosion during the surrender ceremony. The war that followed was unlike anything the American continent had seen or has seen since. 4 years. Approximately 750,000 dead, in more recent estimates that revise upward from the long-accepted figure of 620,000. The number includes combat deaths, deaths from disease, deaths in the prison camps where conditions on both sides were frequently lethal. It does not include an adequate count of black deaths, which were systematically undercounted in the records of the time. I want to be direct about what the Civil War was for the men who fought it on each side, because it is often obscured by the romanticism that has accumulated around the conflict in American memory. For the men of the Confederacy, the stated purpose of the war was to establish an independent nation built explicitly on the permanent enslavement of black people. This was not a subtext. It was the text. Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens gave a speech in March of 1861, 3 weeks before the war began, that historians call the Cornerstone Speech. In it, he explained the fundamental difference between the new Confederate government and the United States it was seceding from. He said, and I am going to paraphrase closely from a speech that is in the public record, "The foundations of the Confederacy are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world, based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth." The cornerstone of the Confederacy was the permanent racial subjugation of black people. The Vice President of the Confederacy said this in a public speech, 3 weeks before the first shots were fired. This is in the record. For the men of the Union, the purpose of the war was initially simpler and less morally elevated than is often remembered. Lincoln's stated war aim from the beginning through 1862 was not to free the enslaved. It was to preserve the Union. He wrote in a letter to newspaper editor Horace Greeley in August of 1862, one of the most famous statements in American political history. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do that. If I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. He was telling the truth. In 1862, Lincoln's primary objective was preserving the Republic. Emancipation was a military strategy before it was a moral commitment. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued on January 1, 1863, freed enslaved people in the Confederate States specifically, not in the border states that had remained in the Union, not in Tennessee, which was already largely under Union control. In the Confederate States, where the Union had no immediate power to enforce it, it was, in its immediate practical effect, limited. As a military document, it served a specific purpose. It reframed the war as a war about slavery, making it diplomatically impossible for Britain and France, who had been considering recognizing the Confederacy, to do so. Both countries had abolished slavery. Formally joining a war in defense of it was politically untenable after Lincoln had made the Union's position explicit. And it authorized the enlistment of black men in the Union Army. This second consequence was transformative. By the end of the war, approximately 180,000 black men had served in the Union Army. 23 received the Medal of Honor. Nearly 40,000 died in service. They fought in every theater of the war, in more than 450 engagements, in some of the most brutal combat of the conflict. The Battle of the Crater, the assault on Battery Wagner, where the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, the regiment made famous in the film Glory, suffered casualties of approximately 40% in a direct assault on a Confederate fortification. Port Hudson, Louisiana, where black troops of the 1st and 3rd Louisiana Native Guards charged Confederate positions under murderous fire in May of 1863, and where their commanding officer wrote afterward that their conduct was such as the hopes of their friends had anticipated and their enemies had not expected. These men were fighting for something specific, not for abstract union or constitutional principle. They were fighting for the freedom of their families, their communities, their people. And they were doing it in an army that paid them less than white soldiers, that often assigned them the most dangerous and degrading labor details, that offered their families no guarantee of security, and that was commanded by officers, many of them from the North, who held a wide spectrum of views on what black Americans actually deserved once the war was won. That last question, what black Americans deserved once the war was won, was the question that would define the decade after the war ended. And the answer that the country ultimately gave to it is one of the great betrayals in American history. But I am getting ahead of the story. By 1864, the war had ground into something that no one on either side had anticipated in 1861, when the new Confederacy expected a quick victory, and many in the North expected the rebellion to collapse within months. It had become industrial slaughter, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Cold Harbor. In 3 days at Cold Harbor, in June of 1864, Ulysses Grant's Army of the Potomac suffered approximately 7,000 casualties in a single failed assault. In 1 hour of fighting, according to some accounts. Grant continued south. Sherman moved on Atlanta. Philip Sheridan laid waste to the Shenandoah Valley, a campaign of deliberate agricultural destruction designed to deny the Confederacy the food supply that sustained its armies in Virginia. The war had become a total war, a war against the economic and agricultural infrastructure of the Confederacy as much as against its armies, and that strategy was working. Atlanta fell in September of 1864. Sherman began his march to the sea in November, cutting a 60-mile wide path of destruction across Georgia to Savannah, living off the land, burning what could not be carried, tearing up railroad lines, dismantling the industrial and transportation infrastructure of the Confederate heartland. By the time Sherman's army reached Savannah in December of 1864, the Confederacy's material situation was becoming untenable. Its supply lines were cut, its production capacity was devastated, its armies were dwindling, and something else was happening. Enslaved people were leaving, in enormous numbers. As Union armies moved through Confederate territory, enslaved people fled their plantations by the thousands and made for the Union lines. They brought intelligence. They brought knowledge of Confederate troop movements, supply routes, fortification locations, information gathered over years of invisible labor in the houses and fields of Confederate officers and officials who had never thought much about whether the people serving their meals were paying attention to their conversations. They were. The formerly enslaved people who attached themselves to Union armies as laborers, guides, cooks, and eventually soldiers did not simply watch the institution that had held them collapse from the outside. They participated actively in its destruction. Harriet Tubman, by 1863, was working as a spy and scout for the Union Army. In June of 1863, she guided Colonel James Montgomery and 150 black Union soldiers up the Combahee River in South Carolina in a nighttime raid that liberated approximately 700 enslaved people and destroyed Confederate supply infrastructure across the region. She was paid nothing for this service. She applied for a pension decades later and was denied. She received a pension for her late husband's military service, not her own, and only after years of advocacy by supporters. She died in 1913. By the spring of 1865, the military end was near. Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. The remaining Confederate armies surrendered in the weeks that followed. On April 14, 1865, 5 days after Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater in Washington by John Wilkes Booth, an actor and Confederate sympathizer, during a performance of Our American Cousin. He died the following morning. Andrew Johnson of Tennessee became president, and everything that came next depended almost entirely on that fact. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified on December 6, 1865. It abolished slavery and involuntary servitude in the United States of America. With one exception, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. These 19 words. This single exception, this one clause. I want you to hold them in your mind as we move forward, because the men who wrote the Black Codes, the vagrancy laws, the debt peonage statutes, the convict leasing system, everything that would reconstruct the machinery of coerced black labor in the decades after emancipation, they read those 19 words very carefully. And they built their entire legal architecture on them. But before we get to what came after, we need to understand what the years immediately after the war actually produced. Because Reconstruction is one of the most important and most systematically misrepresented periods in American history. And understanding what it actually was and what it actually achieved is essential to understanding why its destruction was the catastrophe that it was. The years between 1865 and 1877 were not, as they were portrayed for a century in American textbooks, and in the popular culture built on those textbooks, a period of chaos and corruption imposed on a suffering South by vindictive Northern radicals and incompetent black politicians. That story was constructed deliberately and systematically by the same men who destroyed Reconstruction, and it served a specific purpose. It made the destruction of Reconstruction seem like a restoration of order rather than what it actually was, which was the violent overthrow of a functioning democratic experiment. Let me tell you what Reconstruction actually was. In the years between 1865 and 1877, with the support of federal law and federal troops, and in the face of constant and organized violent resistance, Black Americans in the former Confederate states did something that had never happened in American history, and would not happen again for nearly a century. They voted, in enormous numbers. They won elections. They held office. Black men served in the United States Senate and the House of Representatives. Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce of Mississippi. Joseph Rainey of South Carolina, the first black congressman to serve in the House of Representatives. John Roy Lynch, also of Mississippi, who served 3 terms in Congress and was elected Speaker of the Mississippi House of Representatives. By 1870, more than 700 black men held elected office across the South. Sheriffs, judges, state legislators, school board members, city councilmen. These were not symbolic appointments or ceremonial positions. These were men exercising real governmental authority in real communities. The Reconstruction state governments they participated in built things. They built the first public school systems in the history of the American South. Before Reconstruction, public education in the South barely existed for white children and was legally prohibited for black children. The Reconstruction governments created public school systems that served both races. They built hospitals. They built railroads. They reformed tax systems that had concentrated wealth among the planter class. They modernized state constitutions. And the black communities of the South were building in parallel. Churches became the anchoring institutions of black civic life, serving simultaneously as houses of worship, political organizing centers, schools, social service networks, and safe spaces in a society organized to deny black people safety almost everywhere else. Black colleges were founded. Howard University, chartered by Congress in 1867. Fisk University, founded in 1866. Hampton Institute, founded in 1868. Morehouse College, founded in 1867. These institutions were built in the immediate aftermath of slavery by people who had been legally prohibited from learning to read a decade earlier. Land was being purchased. Businesses were opening. A black professional class, small but real, was emerging. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, ministers, business people. It was fragile. It was underfunded. It operated under constant threat of violence. Every gain was contested. Every black official who took office understood that his life was in danger. But it was real. It was a genuine democratic experiment. And it was working in the ways that matter. People were voting. People were governing. People were building. Schools were opening. Communities were growing. This is what Reconstruction was. And here is the detail that matters more than any other in understanding what followed. The people who destroyed it did not do so because it was failing. They destroyed it because it was succeeding. The organized violent resistance to Reconstruction began almost immediately after the war ended. It did not wait for federal troops to leave. It operated alongside them. The Ku Klux Klan was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee in December of 1865, the same year the 13th Amendment was ratified. It was founded by former Confederate officers. Its first Grand Wizard was Nathan Bedford Forrest, one of the most talented cavalry commanders of the Confederate Army, and the man responsible for the Fort Pillow Massacre of April 1864, in which Confederate forces under his command killed black Union soldiers who had already surrendered. Within 2 years of its founding, the Klan had spread across the South and was conducting systematic campaigns of terror against black voters, black office holders, black community leaders, and the white Republicans who supported Reconstruction. They burned black schools and churches. They attacked black homes at night. They beat and killed black men who had voted, who held office, who organized politically, who simply refused to demonstrate the deference that the former slave system had required. They were not random in their targeting. They were strategic. The people they killed and the people they threatened were specifically the people whose elimination would most effectively destroy the infrastructure of black political power. The teachers who taught in the Freedmen's Bureau schools, the ministers who led the churches that organized political meetings, the community leaders who registered voters, the lawyers who helped black farmers understand their contracts. These were the people who were targeted. Because these were the people without whom the democratic experiment could not function. Congress responded. The Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, sometimes called the Ku Klux Klan Acts, gave the federal government direct authority to prosecute Klan violence as a federal crime. They authorized the president to suspend habeas corpus in areas where Klan terrorism was preventing citizens from exercising their constitutional rights. Ulysses Grant used these powers. In 1871, he declared martial law in 9 counties of South Carolina and sent federal troops to suppress the Klan there. Hundreds of Klan members were prosecuted in federal courts. The prosecutions were real. They worked where they were applied. Klan activity in South Carolina declined significantly after the federal intervention. But here is the problem. The federal government did not have the will to apply this level of intervention everywhere it was needed, for as long as it was needed. The political coalition that had supported Reconstruction, the radical Republicans who believed that genuine equality for Black Americans required sustained federal commitment, was eroding. The business interests of the North were tired of the expense and the political drama. The presidential election of 1872, in which Grant won a second term, was followed by a severe economic depression in 1873 that shifted Northern political attention to economic concerns. And there was something else, something harder to quantify, but essential to understand. A significant portion of white Americans in the North, people who had supported the war to save the Union, who had supported emancipation as a military necessity, were not prepared for what genuine racial equality actually required, were not prepared for the sustained federal presence, the sustained federal spending, the sustained confrontation with white Southern resistance that actually protecting Black citizens' constitutional rights would have demanded. They wanted the question settled. They were tired of it. They were willing to accept a settlement that was not justice, so long as it was labeled as peace. The Redeemers, as the former Confederates who were retaking control of Southern state governments called themselves, understood this Northern fatigue perfectly. They used it. They ran propaganda campaigns in Northern newspapers about the corruption and incompetence of Reconstruction governments. Stories that were largely fabricated or wildly exaggerated, but that resonated with a Northern audience already looking for reasons to disengage. The White League and the Red Shirts, successor organizations to the Klan that operated more openly and with less attempt at concealment, conducted increasingly large-scale campaigns of political violence in the elections of 1874 and 1876. In Louisiana, the White League killed between 60 and 150 Black men in the Colfax Massacre of April 1873, the single bloodiest act of racial violence in the Reconstruction era. They were responding to a dispute over the results of a local election that Black Republicans had won. The federal prosecution of the Colfax perpetrators reached the Supreme Court in United States versus Cruikshank in 1876. The Supreme Court ruled that the federal government could not prosecute private citizens for violating the constitutional rights of other citizens. The 14th Amendment, the court held, only prohibited state action, not private violence. If a private mob killed Black voters, that was a matter for state courts, not federal ones. In states where the men running the courts and the juries were the same men organizing the mobs, this ruling was a death warrant. The court had just told the men running the terror campaigns what Lincoln's election had told the slaveholders in 1860. You are free to do what you are already doing. The federal government will not stop you. The Compromise of 1877 and the final betrayal. The presidential election of 1876 was a genuine constitutional crisis. Republican Rutherford Hayes ran against Democrat Samuel Tilden. Tilden won the popular vote. The electoral votes of 3 southern states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, were disputed. Both parties claimed victory in all 3. Without those states, neither candidate had the 185 electoral votes needed to win. Congress created a special electoral commission to resolve the dispute. It voted along party lines, 8-7, to award all 3 states, and therefore the presidency, to Hayes. The Democrats in Congress could have blocked the certification. They did not. There was a deal. The terms of the deal were never put in a single written document, but historians have reconstructed them from the correspondence and political negotiations of the period. The essential bargain was this: the Democrats would accept Hayes as president. In exchange, the Republican administration would withdraw federal troops from the remaining southern states, where they were still protecting Black citizens and Reconstruction governments. Federal enforcement of the 14th and 15th Amendments in the South would end. The South would be allowed to settle its own affairs. which meant the Redeemers would be allowed to finish the work the Klan had started. Federal troops left Louisiana and South Carolina in April of 1877. Within months, the Reconstruction governments in those states collapsed under the weight of the violence and intimidation that federal troops had been holding back. It was over. The men who had fought a war to end slavery had 12 years later negotiated the effective re-enslavement of the people that war had freed. Not in the form of chains and auction blocks, in the form of vagrancy laws and debt peonage and convict leasing, and the systematic destruction of every institution that Black Americans had built during the Reconstruction years. In the years immediately following 1877, Black voter registration in Mississippi dropped from nearly 100% to nearly zero. Similar collapses happened across the South. The schools that Reconstruction governments had built were defunded and segregated and starved of resources until they barely functioned. The Black office holders were driven out of office by fraud and terror. The land that Black families had purchased was taken through legal manipulation and economic coercion and outright theft. Everything that had been built in 12 years was dismantled in half that time. And this is the fact that I want you to carry into the final section of this documentary. The Compromise of 1877 was not an agreement between strangers with different interests. It was a transaction between people who understood each other very well. The Northern Republicans, who agreed to abandon Black Americans in the South in exchange for the presidency, understood exactly what they were trading away. They had letters from the South. They had reports from the Freedmen's Bureau. They had the testimony of Black congressmen who told them in direct language what would happen when the troops left. They knew, and they made the deal anyway. The great betrayal of Reconstruction was not a failure of knowledge. It was a failure of will. A decision by the most powerful political party in the country, the party of Lincoln, the party that had fought the war and passed the amendments, to prioritize its own political survival over its constitutional obligation to 4 million Americans who had trusted it with their lives. That decision set the terms for everything that followed. The sharecropping system, the debt peonage, the convict leasing, the lynching era, the Jim Crow laws, the separate and grotesquely unequal schools and hospitals and courthouses and voting booths that would define Black American life for the next 90 years. All of it grew from the soil of that deal. All of it was made possible by the choice, made in Washington in 1877 by men who knew what they were doing, to let it happen. The war had freed 4 million people. The peace put them back into bondage by other means. And it would take another war, a Cold War this time, and a civil rights movement that cost more lives and more suffering than it should ever have required to begin, only begin, to dismantle what the Compromise of 1877 had made possible. That is where we go in the final section. From the end of Reconstruction, through the mechanisms of legal segregation, the long resistance, the civil rights movement, and the question of what was never repaired, and what the unpaid debt of American slavery actually amounts to when you try to calculate it honestly. The numbers are not comfortable, but they are real, and they are waiting. There is a question that historians ask when they study the period after Reconstruction. A question that feels almost too large to frame cleanly. How do you build a prison without walls? Because that is what the American South did between 1877 and 1965. It built a system of racial control that was, in its essential function, a continuation of slavery by other means. It held people in place. It extracted their labor. It denied them political power. It punished any attempt to leave or resist. And it did all of this without chattel slavery as its legal foundation, because the 13th Amendment had made chattel slavery unconstitutional. Except, as we discussed at the end of the last section, as a punishment for crime. The men who built the Jim Crow system were not improvising. They were engineers. They studied the problem carefully. They understood what functions slavery had performed and what legal architecture would be needed to perform those same functions under a different name. They built it piece by piece, law by law, court ruling by court ruling, in exactly the way their grandfathers had built the original slave codes between 1660 and 1705. And the result was a system so comprehensive, so durable, and so deeply woven into the structure of American law and American life that it took nearly a century to dismantle, and the dismantling is not finished yet. That is where we begin this final section, with the machinery, with the specific laws and the specific cases and the specific economic arrangements through which the promise of emancipation was systematically destroyed, and then with the people who fought it, who risked everything to fight it, many of whom died fighting it, and then with the question that is still waiting for an answer. What is owed? The Confederate States were not given much time to mourn before they began the work of Reconstruction, their own kind of Reconstruction. Within months of the war's end, the former Confederate States began passing what became known as the Black Codes, comprehensive legal frameworks designed to return the formerly enslaved population to something as close to their previous condition as the 13th Amendment's language would permit. Mississippi passed its Black Code in November of 1865, less than 7 months after Lee's surrender at Appomattox. The Mississippi Code required all black people to have written proof of employment at the start of each year. Any black person without such proof could be arrested for vagrancy. Convicted vagrants could be hired out to employers who would pay their fine. In exchange, the convicted person was required to work for that employer for a period of time determined by the court. If a black worker quit his job before his contract expired, he could be arrested and returned to his employer. Any person who offered work to a black laborer already under contract could be fined. Black children whose parents were deemed unable to support them could be apprenticed to white employers, with preference given to their former enslavers. Read those provisions carefully. They reconstruct, in the language of vagrancy law and labor contract, the essential structure of slavery. Movement without a white employer's authorization was criminalized. Breaking a labor contract was criminalized. Children could be separated from their parents and assigned to their former enslaver. The 13th Amendment had said slavery was abolished except as punishment for crime. The Black Codes manufactured the crimes. South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, and Texas passed similar codes within the same months. The specific provisions varied, but the architecture was consistent. Black people could not own firearms in some states, could not rent land in rural areas in others, could not testify against white people in courts, could not assemble without white supervision, could not preach without a license from a white-controlled body. The Republican Congress, looking at these codes, was furious. They refused to seat representatives from the former Confederate states, passed the 14th and 15th Amendments giving black Americans citizenship and voting rights, divided the South into military districts, and launched the Reconstruction program that we examined in the last section. The Black Codes were temporarily suspended, but the men who wrote them waited. They were patient in the way that people are patient when they are certain that the balance of power will eventually shift in their favor. When they understand that the people standing between them and what they want are going to tire before they do. They were right. After 1877, the Black Codes came back. Not under that name, under the name of Jim Crow. Jim Crow is a phrase that is often used as if it describes a single thing, a set of segregation laws, separate water fountains and separate schools and separate railroad cars. That picture is accurate but radically incomplete. Jim Crow was not primarily about separation. It was primarily about subordination. The separation was the mechanism. The subordination was the point. Let me walk you through the full architecture, because understanding what it actually consisted of changes how you understand both its cruelty and its durability. The first pillar was disenfranchisement. After the Compromise of 1877 removed federal oversight of Southern elections, the former Confederate states systematically stripped black Americans of the voting rights guaranteed by the 15th Amendment. They did it through a series of devices that were facially race neutral, but designed and administered in explicitly racial ways. The poll tax required payment of a fee to vote. In states where black workers were trapped in sharecropping systems that kept them in perpetual debt, the poll tax was an effective barrier to voting for the majority of the black population. The literacy test required voters to read and interpret sections of the state constitution to the satisfaction of a white registrar. The registrar could ask easy questions of white applicants and impossible questions of black ones, or simply declare the answers inadequate regardless of their content. The same question answered correctly by a black PhD could be ruled wrong. Answered by an illiterate white man, it could be ruled correct. The grandfather clause, used in several states, exempted men from literacy tests and poll taxes if their grandfathers had been eligible to vote before 1867. The grandfather of a black man in 1900 had been enslaved before 1867. The grandfather of a white man had not. The white primary simply excluded black voters from Democratic Party primaries. In the one-party South, winning the Democratic primary was equivalent to winning the election. If black voters could not participate in the primary, their vote in the general election was irrelevant. The combined effect of these devices was total. In Mississippi in 1890, approximately 190,000 black men were eligible to vote. By 1892, after the new state constitution implementing literacy tests and poll taxes, the number of registered black voters had fallen to approximately 8,615, a decline of more than 95%. That is not voter suppression, as the phrase is commonly used today. That is the complete elimination of a political constituency by legal machinery. And it was replicated, with variations, across every former Confederate state within 20 years. The second pillar was economic control. The sharecropping and tenant farming systems that replaced plantation slavery were designed to produce exactly what plantation slavery had produced: the permanent, unfree labor of black agricultural workers for the benefit of white landowners. The mechanics were elegantly simple and brutally effective. A black farmer would enter into a sharecropping agreement with a white landowner. He would farm the land. At the end of the year, the harvest would be divided, typically 50% to the farmer and 50% to the landowner. Out of his 50%, the farmer would repay the advances the landowner had extended during the year: seed, tools, food, clothing, medicine, all purchased on credit from the landowner's store at prices the landowner set. The accounting was done by the landowner. The farmer had no independent access to the books, no ability to verify the figures, and in many cases, no ability to read the ledger, even if he had been given access to it. Because the second component of the system was the systematic denial of education to black children. In the years after Reconstruction, Southern states funded black public schools at a fraction of the rate they funded white schools. By the early 20th century, in states like Mississippi and Alabama, white public school spending per pupil ran 5 to 10 times higher than black public school spending per pupil. In some counties, the ratio was higher. Teachers at black schools were paid less. Black school buildings were older, more dilapidated, less equipped. The school year at black schools was shorter to ensure that black children were available for agricultural labor during planting and harvest seasons. The result was a population kept functionally illiterate, generation after generation, specifically to prevent them from being able to dispute the accounts of the men who employed and exploited them. This was not an accident. It was a policy, and the people who designed and administered it understood its purpose. The third pillar was legal control. The courts of the Jim Crow South were not systems for the equal administration of justice. They were instruments of racial control. Black defendants faced all white juries by design, because black citizens were systematically excluded from jury pools through a combination of formal mechanisms and informal intimidation. An all-white jury in a county where white violence against black people was routine was not a neutral fact-finding body. It was a shield for white perpetrators and a weapon against black defendants. Black witnesses were routinely disbelieved, regardless of the evidence, when testifying against white defendants. Black testimony against white accusers was, in many jurisdictions, legally insufficient to secure a conviction. The laws themselves were asymmetrical. Crimes by white people against black people were typically charged as lesser offenses, tried perfunctorily, and resolved with minimal or no punishment. Crimes by black people against white people, or alleged crimes, including many that were wholly invented, were charged as the most serious available offenses and prosecuted with maximum force. And there was the convict leasing system, which we need to examine directly because it is the most complete expression of what the Jim Crow legal system actually was. Douglas Blackmun, whose book Slavery by Another Name won the Pulitzer Prize in 2008, spent more than a decade in the corporate and county records of the American South. What he found there was not a supplemental or marginal aspect of the Jim Crow economy. It was a second slavery, operating under color of law, hidden in plain sight in the ledgers and lease agreements and county court records of states that had abolished slavery 40 years before. Here's how it worked. A black man in Alabama or Georgia or Mississippi in 1890 could be arrested for vagrancy, meaning for being unemployed without a white employer's authorization, or for talking too loudly to a white person, or for gambling, meaning playing cards with other black men on a Sunday afternoon, or for loitering, or for using obscene language, or for dozens of other minor or invented offenses that existed in these states' codes specifically to provide legal justification for arrest. He was brought before a justice of the peace, not a circuit court judge, not a jury trial, just a local official, usually the same man who had issued the warrant. He was convicted, typically in a proceeding that lasted minutes, and sentenced to a fine he could not pay plus court costs, which he also could not pay. Unable to pay, he was leased to a private employer, a coal company, a turpentine operation, a railroad construction firm, a lumber camp. The employer paid his fine to the county, and in return received the right to his labor for a specified period. During that period, the man was under the complete control of the employer. He could not leave. He could not refuse to work. He could be physically punished for insufficient productivity at the employer's discretion. He had no legal recourse. And the debt kept growing. Because while he was working off his fine, he was being charged for his food, his housing, his clothing, his tools, at rates set by the employer. Charges that accumulated faster than his labor could retire them. So the debt grew instead of shrinking, and the period of servitude extended accordingly. Men entered this system for 30-day sentences on minor charges and died in it years later. Blackmun documented case after case of black men arrested on fraudulent charges, leased to private companies, worked in lethal conditions, and buried in unmarked graves when they died. Men whose names appeared in the arrest records and the lease agreements, and then vanished from the documentary record entirely, because the records of their deaths were never kept with any particular care. He documented the correspondence between company executives and county sheriffs, letters that were explicit about the relationship between the arrest process and the labor supply, sheriffs who were paid a fee per prisoner delivered, judges whose sentences aligned with the labor needs of local companies, governors who signed lease agreements and received political contributions from the companies that benefited from them. In Alabama, at the peak of the convict leasing system, the revenue generated by leasing black prisoners to private companies represented approximately 40% of the entire state budget. The state of Alabama was, in a material and fiscal sense, dependent on the forced labor of black men arrested on manufactured charges for its financial functioning. This is not a fringe historical claim. It is the documented record. It is in the state archives. It has been verified by multiple independent historians. And the companies that benefited from it were not obscure regional operations. United States Steel, through its subsidiary Tennessee Coal and Iron, was one of the largest buyers of convict labor in Alabama. The coal mined by convict laborers in Alabama's mines went into the furnaces that produced the steel that built American infrastructure. That built American skyscrapers. That built American industry. Andrew Carnegie, who founded what became United States Steel, is remembered as one of the greatest philanthropists in American history. The libraries he funded bear his name in towns and cities across the country. Universities have endowed chairs named after him. His theories of philanthropy are taught in business schools. The men who mined the coal that built his fortune in the period when his company leased convict labor died in mines in Alabama, under conditions that company supervisors described internally as producing a mortality rate that was affecting productivity. They are not remembered by name. Most of them have no memorial. Many have no marked grave. This is the thing that the standard American education almost never forces you to reckon with directly. The physical infrastructure of modern America was built in significant part by men and women working under conditions that were, by any honest description, slavery. Not metaphorical slavery, not slavery-like conditions. Slavery, with whips and chains and locked quarters and zero legal recourse and no ability to leave. After emancipation, after the 13th Amendment, after the Civil War that cost 750,000 lives, the system that the war was supposed to destroy rebuilt itself within a decade, with the full knowledge and active participation of state governments, major corporations, and the federal government, which watched and declined to intervene. Between 1910 and 1970, approximately 6 million Black Americans left the South and moved to cities in the North, the Midwest, and the West. Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, New York, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Oakland. They left because of the violence, which never stopped. They left because of the economic exploitation, which never stopped. They left because a generation that had been told by the rhetoric of the world wars that they were fighting for freedom and democracy came home to find that the freedom and democracy did not apply to them, and decided that staying in places where the machinery of their subjugation was embedded in every institution, every courtroom, every voting booth, every school, was a choice they did not have to make. They left for many reasons, but they also left because the industrial economy of the northern cities was, for a specific period in the early and mid-20th century, offering something genuinely different. Factory jobs, assembly line work, steel mill work. The organized labor movement, for all its own deep racism, was at least in some industries and in some unions offering wages and protections that the sharecropping counties had never offered. The Great Migration was an act of collective self-determination on a scale that the country has never fully appreciated. 6 million people making the decision, individually and in families and in communities, to leave the places where they had been born and worked and buried their dead, to travel hundreds or thousands of miles to cities most of them had never seen, to rebuild their lives in an environment that was hostile in different ways, but not in all the same ways. That decision built the Black communities of the northern cities. It built the churches, the newspapers, the political organizations, the cultural institutions that produced the Harlem Renaissance and the Chicago Blues and the Detroit Sound and the labor organizing of A. Philip Randolph and countless other expressions of Black civic and cultural life that are inseparable from the story of 20th century America. But the North was not the promised land, and the men and women who went there discovered this in ways that were sometimes violent and always grinding. The Red Summer of 1919. The Chicago race riot, in which 38 people were killed, and more than 1,000 Black families lost their homes to arson, triggered by the killing of a Black teenager who crossed an invisible line in Lake Michigan between the white swimming area and the Black swimming area. The Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. The prosperous Black neighborhood of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, known as Black Wall Street, had been built over 2 decades by Black entrepreneurs, professionals, and workers into one of the most economically successful Black communities in the United States. It had hotels, banks, law offices, medical offices, grocery stores, movie theaters, schools, churches, an entire self-sufficient economy. On the night of May 31st and the morning of June 1st, 1921, a white mob attacked Greenwood. The immediate trigger was a disputed incident involving a young Black man named Dick Rowland in an elevator with a white woman named Sarah Page. The charge was assault. The evidence was negligible. The woman herself declined to press charges. But the mob did not need a conviction. It needed a pretext. Over the course of approximately 16 hours, the white mob, aided in some documented instances by the Tulsa Police Department and the Oklahoma National Guard, burned Greenwood to the ground. 35 square blocks of Black-owned property destroyed. Approximately 1,250 homes burned. Every church, every school, every business, every professional office in Greenwood burned or looted. The death toll has never been fully established. Contemporary estimates ranged from 100 to 300 people killed. A 2001 Oklahoma Commission investigation concluded that between 100 and 300 people had been killed, with the number likely near the higher end. Airplanes. There were airplanes. Reports from survivors and from contemporary witnesses describe private planes flying over Greenwood during the attack. Whether they were used to shoot into the neighborhood or only for surveillance has been disputed and investigated and never definitively resolved. But there were planes over a black neighborhood during a massacre. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, in 1921, no one was ever convicted of any crime for the destruction of Greenwood. No reparations were ever paid to the families who lost everything. The property was not returned. The wealth that 2 decades of work had built was not replaced. The survivors rebuilt. They rebuilt on the same ground, again, because where else would they go? Tulsa was not the only massacre. Rosewood, Florida in 1923. The Ocoee Massacre in Florida in 1920. The Elaine Massacre in Arkansas in 1919, where black sharecroppers who had organized a union to obtain independent accounting of their cotton profits were hunted through the fields and swamps by white mobs accompanied by United States Army soldiers. What these events had in common was not only the violence, it was the economic target. Every one of them was directed at black communities that had built something, that had accumulated some measure of economic independence, some degree of wealth, some institutional infrastructure that represented an escape from the dependency and subjugation that the Jim Crow system required. The violence was not random. It was surgical. It went where the threat of black economic independence was most visible and most dangerous to the hierarchy that depended on black poverty to function. And when the violence passed, the wealth was gone. The property was gone. The institutions were gone. The years of work that had built them were erased, and the country moved on. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s is taught in the standard American curriculum as a story about speeches and marches and legal victories, about Martin Luther King and the March on Washington and the Civil Rights Act. That story is true. Those things happened. Those victories were real. But the version of the story that is taught in most American schools is a compressed and sanitized version that leaves out the essential facts about what those victories cost the people who won them. Let me give you the cost. Medgar Evers, NAA CP Field Secretary in Mississippi, World War II veteran who spent years registering black voters in one of the most dangerous states in the country for that kind of work, shot in his driveway in front of his home and his children on June 12, 1963. His killer not convicted until 1994, 31 years later. Emmett Till, 14 years old, from Chicago, kidnapped, tortured, shot through the head, his body thrown in a river with a 75-pound cotton gin fan tied to his neck with barbed wire. The men who killed him acquitted by an all-white jury in 67 minutes. One juror later admitted they took a lunch break to make it look like they had deliberated. The killers sold their story to Look magazine for $4,000, describing exactly what they had done, protected by double jeopardy. The woman whose false accusation triggered it admitted in 2017 that she had fabricated the account of what Emmett did. She was never charged with anything. Addie Mae Collins, 14. Cynthia Wesley, 14. Carol Robertson, 14. Carol Denise McNair, 11. Killed in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham on a Sunday morning in September of 1963. The lead suspect not convicted until 1977. A second not convicted until 2001. A third not convicted until 2002. A fourth died without ever being charged. Herbert Lee, a farmer in Amite County, Mississippi, who worked with NAACP Field Secretary Bob Moses to register black voters, shot in the head by a white state legislator named E.H. Hurst in front of witnesses in September of 1961. The grand jury, all white, declined to indict after a 30-minute deliberation. Hurst was never charged. Louis Allen, who had witnessed the Lee murder and told the FBI what he had seen, and who had been harassed and threatened for years because of his willingness to tell the truth about it, shot 3 times in the driveway of his home in January of 1964. No one was ever charged. Jimmy Lee Jackson, a young farmer and deacon in Marion, Alabama, shot by a state trooper named James Bonard Fowler during a peaceful voting rights march in February of 1965. His death directly inspired the march from Selma to Montgomery. Fowler was not charged until 2007. He pled guilty in 2010 to misdemeanor manslaughter and served 6 months. Viola Luzzo, a white woman from Detroit who had driven to Alabama to help after Bloody Sunday, shot by Klan members while driving a young black man back after a march. She was the mother of 5 children. Jonathan Daniels, a white seminary student from New Hampshire, shot in Hayneville, Alabama, in August of 1965, standing in front of a black teenager named Ruby Sales to shield her from a shotgun blast by a man named Tom Coleman. Coleman was tried for manslaughter by an all-white jury. He was acquitted. These are not the most famous names from the civil rights movement. They are not the people whose faces are on the posters. They are the people who understood what they were walking into and walked into it anyway, who understood that the machinery that had run for a century did not intend to stop voluntarily, that demanding the rights that the Constitution guaranteed required confronting people who had demonstrated across 3 generations that they were willing to kill to prevent those rights from being exercised. They knew this, and they went anyway. Into the courthouses, into the voting registration lines, into the streets of Birmingham and Selma and Albany and Philadelphia, Mississippi. And the machine did what machines do when they encounter resistance. It tried to destroy them. Sometimes it succeeded. The people who did not die are not less courageous than the people who did. But the deaths are part of the story. They are the cost that was paid for rights that should never have had to be purchased with blood. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination in public accommodations and employment. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 banned the discriminatory practices that had disenfranchised black voters across the South for 90 years. These were not gifts. They were not the natural evolution of American democracy toward its ideals. They were the result of sustained, organized, dangerous, costly human effort by people who had no reason to trust that effort would be rewarded and trusted it anyway. And they did not end the story. The Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965 dismantled the legal architecture of Jim Crow. They did not repair what Jim Crow had done. This is a distinction that is almost never made clearly in the standard American telling of this history, and it matters more than almost anything else in understanding where the country is today. Consider what was not repaired. The land. In the years between 1877 and 1950, black families across the South lost land through a range of mechanisms that historians have documented with increasing precision. Outright theft by white neighbors backed by the threat of violence. Fraudulent tax sales in which land was sold for delinquent taxes assessed at fraudulent values, with the proceeds going to white buyers connected to county government. Heirs property schemes in which the legal complexity of inheritance in families that had no access to lawyers allowed white purchasers to acquire land by buying out a single heir and then forcing the sale of the whole property. Economic coercion that forced sales at a fraction of market value. The total amount of land taken from black families in the South during this period has been estimated by economists and historians at somewhere between 4 and 12 million acres. That land had value in 1950. It has more value now. The families that lost it did not get it back when the Civil Rights Act passed. The wages. The sharecropping system extracted surplus labor from black workers for approximately 80 years. The difference between what those workers were paid and what they would have been paid in a free and fair labor market was not compensated. Not in 1965. Not ever. The wealth that was not accumulated. Historians who study intergenerational wealth transfer have documented what economists call the racial wealth gap, the difference between median black household wealth and median white household wealth in contemporary America. That gap is substantial. In recent decades, it has hovered around a 10-to-1 ratio. The median white family has approximately 10 times the wealth of the median black family. This gap did not emerge from nothing. It did not emerge from cultural differences or differential work ethic or any of the explanations that are sometimes offered to account for it. It emerged from a specific and documented history. White families in the 20th century were able to accumulate wealth through mechanisms that black families were explicitly excluded from. The GI Bill after World War II offered low-interest mortgages, business loans, and college tuition benefits to veterans. Black veterans were eligible for these benefits on paper. In practice, they were routinely denied them by the white-controlled institutions that administered them. The Federal Housing Administration, which backed mortgages that built the American suburbs in the post-war decades, explicitly redlined black neighborhoods, refusing to back mortgages in areas where black people lived, and refusing to back mortgages for black buyers in white neighborhoods. The suburbs that accumulated value over the post-war decades, that generated the wealth that white families passed to their children and their grandchildren, were built on federally subsidized mortgages that black families were systematically denied. This is not ancient history. The veterans denied GI Bill benefits were alive in 1965. Their children are alive today. Their grandchildren are alive today. The compound interest on what was denied has been accumulating for 80 years. In 1865, there was a moment. A specific, documented moment when something different might have happened. General William Sherman, in January of 1865, 3 months before the war's end, met with 20 black leaders in Savannah, Georgia. He asked them what their people needed. Their spokesperson, Garrison Frazier, a 67-year-old formerly enslaved minister, gave an answer that was precise and practical. He said that they wanted to be placed on land until they were able to buy it and make it their own. They did not ask for charity. They asked for the opportunity to work their own land and keep what they produced. 4 days later, Sherman issued Special Field Order No. 15. It set aside approximately 400,000 acres of confiscated Confederate land along the South Carolina and Georgia coast for distribution to freed families in 40-acre lots. Army mules, surplus from the war effort, were to be loaned to the families to work the land. 40 acres and a mule. By June of 1865, approximately 40,000 black families had been settled on 400,000 acres of Sherman's land. They were building, they were farming, they were creating the foundation of economic independence that Garrison Frazier had described as what freedom actually required. In October of 1865, President Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, a man who had opposed secession but also opposed black equality with a consistency that was absolute and explicit, reversed Sherman's order. He returned the land to its former Confederate owners. The 40,000 families who had been settled on that land received a letter from the federal government informing them that they had to leave. 40,000 families who had been told the land was theirs, who had begun to build on it, removed so that the men who had built the Confederacy to protect their right to own human beings could have their property back. This is the central betrayal at the heart of Reconstruction. Not the political compromises, not the military withdrawal. This, the decision to return the land. Because without land, without economic foundation, without any material base from which to resist the economic coercion that was immediately applied, the legal rights that the constitutional amendments guaranteed were, in practice, hollow. You cannot exercise the right to vote if you will be evicted from your land and blacklisted from employment for doing so. You cannot exercise the right to sue in court if you cannot afford a lawyer, and no lawyer in your county will represent you against a white defendant. You cannot build generational wealth if you have no land to build it on. The decision to return the land to the Confederates was a decision to make emancipation nominal rather than real, and the men who made it knew exactly what they were doing. H.R. 40 is a bill that has been introduced in the United States House of Representatives in every session of Congress since 1989. It was first introduced by Congressman John Conyers of Michigan. After his departure, it has been carried by Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee and others. It does not propose reparations. It proposes a commission to study the legacy of slavery and the possibility of reparations and make recommendations to Congress. A commission to study whether something should be done. It has never passed. Not in 1989. Not in 1999. Not in 2009. Not in any of the sessions of Congress in which it has been introduced for 36 years. This bill is not radical. It does not compel any specific payment to any specific person. It asks the federal government to look at what happened and think about what, if anything, it should do about it. The federal government has declined, repeatedly, explicitly, for 36 years to do that. The arguments against reparations are familiar. They have been made in op-ed pages and congressional floors and dinner table conversations since the concept became part of serious public discussion. Who would receive them? Too hard to identify. How much would be paid? Too hard to calculate. Who would pay? The people alive today did not own slaves. Why should they bear responsibility for what their ancestors did? These are not frivolous questions. They are real questions that deserve real engagement. But I want to be direct about something because precision matters here. The difficulty of calculating an amount is not an argument against acknowledging a debt. It is a reason to do the work of calculation carefully. The difficulty of identifying beneficiaries is not an argument against making a serious effort to identify them. It is a reason to invest in that effort. And the argument that people alive today did not personally own slaves collides with a specific factual problem. The wealth that was built on slavery, and then built again on the sharecropping system, and then built again on the convict leasing system, and then built again on the redlining of the post-war decades, did not evaporate. It was passed down. It sits in portfolios and real estate holdings and educational endowments and corporate structures that exist today. The question is not whether people alive today bear personal moral guilt for what was done before their birth. The question is whether institutions that hold wealth built on documented theft have an obligation to account for that wealth. The economist Thomas Kramer has estimated the total value of unpaid labor during the American slave period, compounded at a modest interest rate, at between $14 and $20 trillion. Other economists have produced other estimates using different methodologies. The numbers vary. The order of magnitude does not. The debt, if it is calculated honestly, is enormous. Not infinite, but enormous. Larger than any figure that has ever been seriously proposed in any reparations legislation. That is why the commission has not been passed. Not because the questions are too hard to answer, because the people with the power to commission the answers are not willing to face what the answers might require. There is a place in Montgomery, Alabama that opened in April of 2018. It sits on a 6-acre hillside above the city that was the first capital of the Confederacy, where Rosa Parks refused to move, where Martin Luther King preached at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. It is called the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. When you walk in, you enter a large open pavilion. Hanging from the structure are more than 800 rectangular steel monuments, roughly the size and shape of a coffin, weathered to the color of old rust. Each one is engraved with the name of a county, and the names of the people who were killed there. Some have many names, some have a few. Some list only unknown, because in some counties, the people who were killed were never recorded by name. As you walk forward through the pavilion, the floor descends. The monuments rise above you. By the time you reach the far end, you are looking up at them from below. You are standing where the ground would have been. They are hanging above you the way bodies hang from trees. Outside the memorial, in a field, there are identical monuments lying flat on the ground, one for each county. The Equal Justice Initiative's plan is for each county to claim its monument, to take it home, to install it in the county seat where the killings happened, to put the names in the public square where the people who watched lived and worked and went to church. Most of the counties have not claimed them. They are still lying in the field, in the rain with the names on them, waiting for the counties where the killing happened to decide whether they are ready to carry them home. I want to end not with a policy argument, but with a fact. Several facts. 4 million people were held in slavery in the United States at its peak. The institution lasted 2.5 centuries, from 1619 to 1865. The legal architecture that replaced it lasted another century, from 1865 to 1965. The wealth gap it produced has not closed in the 60 years since 1965. The names of the people who were enslaved, the vast majority of them, are not in the history books. They are not on monuments in public squares. They are in account books where they were recorded as assets, if they were recorded at all. They are in the oral histories of their descendants, who have kept the names alive because no one else was going to do it. The people who ran the system, the slaveholders who built fortunes on forced labor, the politicians who defended it for generations, the senators who blocked anti-lynching legislation 200 times, the governors who signed convict leasing agreements, the corporate executives whose companies extracted labor from men they knew had been falsely imprisoned. They are remembered. Their portraits hang in government buildings. Their names are on university libraries and city parks and hospital wings. That asymmetry is not incidental. It is the summary of everything we have been discussing. A country that spent 2.5 centuries building legal infrastructure to define certain people as property has not yet fully reckoned with the consequences of that definition, has not yet built the commensurate infrastructure to repair what was done, has not yet looked with full honesty at the gap between the country it claims to be and the country the documentary record shows it was. That reckoning is not in the past. It is a live question. It is being fought over in school boards and legislatures and courts and university classrooms and congressional offices right now. And the people fighting for honest acknowledgement of this history are not fighting for revenge. They are not fighting because they believe that any sum of money can compensate for 2.5 centuries of systematic dehumanization. They are fighting because they understand something that the documentary record supports in full, that the silence is itself a form of ongoing harm, that every year the record is not acknowledged, every year the debt goes unpaid and unnamed and uncalculated, is another year that the communities most damaged by this history do not have the foundation they would need to begin rebuilding on solid ground. The 4 million names from the 1860 census are not in the books. The thousands of names from the lynching era are in a field in Montgomery in the rain. The 6 million names from the Great Migration are in the communities they built, which the country has never fully valued. And the question that this history leaves behind, the question that was present at the creation of the Republic and has never been fully answered, is the same question it has always been. Are those people Americans? Not in the sense of citizenship. That question was settled, at enormous cost, in 1865 and 1868 and 1870 and 1964 and 1965. Americans in the sense that their history is the country's history, that their suffering is the country's responsibility, that their losses are the country's debt, that the country cannot fully understand itself, cannot fully be what it claims to be, without accounting for what it did to them and what it owes them. That question is not answered. It is not even yet fully asked, but it is waiting, with all the patience of people who have been waiting a very long time, and it is not going anywhere.